One of my favorite worship spaces in our area is in the main sanctuary at Daylesford Abbey in Paoli. And if you're not aware of what Daylesford Abbey is, it's a Catholic community in the Norbertine tradition, but its location is often sought out by individuals and groups for day-long or even multiple-day retreats. We've taken various groups there over the years. On one of my very first visits to Daylesford Abbey, the group I was with was being given a tour by one of the priests, and we entered the sanctuary from the main outside public entrance. And after you come in through the big doors, you get into this gathering area. And if you continue going forward towards the sanctuary, the space narrows. And in that narrow space, on either side of you, are these cascading fountains of just water that's continually flowing down. And our group leader was telling us that this was to visualize and represent passing through the Red Sea. To this day, it remains one of the most powerful ways of entering a worship space that I have ever experienced. As you pass through those cascading fountains on either side of you, you become God's Exodus people delivered out of Egypt. And I recalled that experience this week in looking at these two passages and holding them together because they bring up, as Ed mentioned earlier, this passage from Matthew and how the Holy Family is, in a way, echoing the great Exodus story of old. And then this passage from Hebrews, which holds up Jesus in a particular way that we don't often think about. Turning first to Matthew's Gospel, we pick up the story right after the wise men have left, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. And rather than extending and prolonging the Christmas story full of joy and warmth, the lectionary gives us a story that we would probably rather skip. Why on earth does Matthew include this story about a maniacal ruler who summarily orders the death of innocent children? Doesn't Matthew know that this is seriously going to put a downer on our Christmas celebrations? But even so, it is because of what Matthew believes and wants to communicate about this child that he includes this heartbreaking and tragic story of innocent lives lost in Bethlehem. Like much of these early portions of Matthew's Gospel, the story as he tells it is saturated with echoes of the Exodus story. And like that great story of old, this story features the presence of a ruler who would do anything to protect himself and maintain a secure grip on his sphere of power. From what we know, Herod was a very complex person. He was racially an Arab, religiously Jewish, culturally Greek, and politically Roman. He was cunning, meticulous, and would not hesitate to give orders to kill if it bode favorably upon him. As he neared the end of his life, he was particularly prone to paranoid and erratic behavior. History has recorded that shortly before his death, one of his last orders, which fortunately was not carried out, was for his troops to gather up thousands of notables and execute them after he died, so that there would be mourning in the land after the king's death. And so it's not surprising that King Herod would be frightened at the news from visitors from the east that a star had led them to Jerusalem, and they were seeking the King of the Jews, a title that Herod would rather not share with anyone. Rather than receiving this as good news, Herod perceives the presence of the Christ child as an imminent threat to him. So much so that Matthew tells us he resorts to violence to make sure the threat is taken care of. This is the world into which Christ has come, a world in which kings are threatened by babies. And yet that is exactly how God entered the world, as a baby. in the most vulnerable way, relying upon the wisdom, the love, and the protection of parents, and presumably a community of family, friends, and even strangers to preserve the life of this child, all the while traveling into and out of Egypt. As Matthew's gospel unfolds, the stage is set for the clash of kingdoms. The kingdom of heaven Jesus would grow to teach about and proclaim, and the kingdoms of earthly power. I sometimes wonder, in thinking about this episode in Matthew's gospel, if Jesus ever learned about this time in his life. Did he ever learn about what led his family to Egypt for a short time? And if so, was learning about that particular memory what gave Jesus such a soft spot for welcoming children into his presence, and why he had such harsh words for those that would do children harm? Within this passage from Matthew, there are two quotations from the Old Testament, one from Hosea and one from Jeremiah. They're two of several so-called fulfillment passages found in Matthew. But what Matthew seems to be doing with these is not necessarily suggesting that these words from these prophets of old were actually referring to Jesus in the future, even though the contexts in which they were written suggest nothing of the sort. The fulfillment implied here by Matthew is more a sense that Jesus is himself fulfilling the vocation of Israel. The way that Matthew tells the story of Jesus with all of the echoes and allusions to the story of Israel, the way he tells it alerts us to the very real presence of God with us, the one who will perfectly do and be what Israel was called to do and be, but could not. In his life and ministry, Jesus will embody Israel's story. Perhaps another way of thinking about it is how the writer of Hebrews calls Jesus the pioneer of our salvation. How fitting that God should make the pioneer of our salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. And then words from Psalm 22 are placed on Jesus' lips, where he says, "I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you." The passage continues to explore how Jesus became like us in every aspect, sharing our flesh and blood, being tested as we are tested, and experiencing what we experience. These words from the book of Hebrews add another dimension to the way in which Jesus is our Emmanuel, God with us. This quote from Psalm 22 is worship language. And remember, it's a psalm that begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But these words that are put on Jesus' lips in Hebrews, "in the midst of the congregation, I will praise you," gives us this amazing picture that Jesus is God with us in the midst of the people of God as they worship and offer praise, thanksgiving, and even at times lament. Jesus shares all of what we bring to worship and takes it upon himself because he is in our midst and in our presence. And all along the way of life's journey, he walks with us, experiencing all of life's tragedy, heartbreak, joy, and gladness. He truly is the pioneer of our salvation, the one who goes ahead of us. And in so doing, he fully knows the darkness and depths of evil that may lurk in the world. And so, as we begin this new year, I don't know what the prospect of a new year holds for you. But I do know that there is nothing on earth that we might experience that is outside the realm of God's wisdom, understanding, and love and compassion for us. Jesus calls us his brothers and his sisters. In the midst of the congregation, he will offer praise. And as we gather on this New Year's Day in a space like this to pray and to worship, both of these passages, as we hold them together, tell us that Jesus is in our presence. He is not far away. He is within us and in our very company. And Jesus leads our worship as one of us because he has walked among us. The one whom wise men sought to worship now perfects our worship. The one who was delivered into and out of Egypt is our great deliverer, delivering us from the exile of sin and death and fear and insecurity and whatever else would do us harm. Thanks be to God this day, and thanks be to God this new year. Amen.